very grateful that Pastor Jones and Sue came and we had a chance to visit with them and to hear from Pastor again. I could never wrap my head around calling him Dewey, which I know many of you knew him as Dewey before you knew him as Pastor. And I asked him if I could continue to call him Pastor. And he has been kind enough to let me do that. And I do appreciate our young fellows that call me Pastor Joe. That's nice. It's not necessary, but it is a kindness, and I know it's done out of respect, and that is why I call him Pastor as well. Our text is Matthew chapter 4 this morning. And so I would like for you to follow along as I read out loud, starting in verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread." But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." Then the devil took him into the holy city and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple. And he said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "On the other hand, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him. Our portion this morning is, in fact, about the testing and temptation of Jesus. This is, in fact, a witness into spiritual warfare. And so I'm going to give you a lot of scriptures to think about this morning. And the first one I want you to do is, if you'll change the slide, is I would like for you to consider this. Remember, the book of James tells us this in James 1:13. No one undergoing a trial should say, "I am being tempted by God," since God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. God never tempts us. However, God sometimes does test us, and he does allow us to be tempted. I want you to recognize that God is not setting up a sting operation and enticing you to sin. Not so. And so this morning I want to look at two aspects of this. We'll go to the next slide. I want to look at the testing of Jesus, which is the 40-day, 40-night fast. And then I want to look at the next slide, the temptation. And I'm going to focus most of my attention on the temptation. This is probably the most provocative slide I've ever put up, and it's not meant to be judgmental, but I want you to be very aware of this, and I do believe this firmly. If you usually don't stick to your values when being tested or tempted, they are not values, they're platitudes. So if you consistently say, "I believe in Jesus," but you consistently deny him when given the opportunity, it really does beg the question, is that a value, or is that a hope so, an ambition, a platitude? So again, if you usually don't stick to your values when you're being tested or tempted, they're not values, they're platitudes. Now that does not mean that you will pass every test. I work with students that tend to expect they get an A every time they take a test, and they're blown away when they fail. I want you to know that when we're tested, sometimes we realize that we aren't as strong as we thought we were, and it's very humbling. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a platitude unless that's what frequently, if that's what mostly happens, then it would be a platitude. And so I want us to take us again to refresh your memory that Matthew's method of giving out information is that he will give us chronicles, typically 3 chronicles of information or incidents that have happened, and then he'll give us the curriculum. There'll be a teaching lesson by Jesus. So if we go to the next slide, you're going to see that the chronicle, a factual written account of important or historical facts or events in the order of their occurrence. We looked a couple of weeks ago at baptism. Today will be temptation, and then we'll look at ministry. If we go to the next slide, the curriculum that will follow that is the Sermon on the Mount, and it'll be from Matthew chapter 1 through chapter 7 and verses 1 through 28. This morning, however, we'll go to the next slide, we are in fact on the testing and temptation of Jesus. So, looking at our next slide, the testing was the 40 days and nights of fasting. Now, there are 3 instances of this duration of fasting in the Scriptures. This is a God-undertaken event. The rule of 3 still applies to most of us, right? And that is 3 minutes without air and you don't survive. 3 days without water and typically you don't survive. And 3 weeks without food and you typically don't survive. These are God undergirding moments. They are God directed moments. This is not people saying, I want to prove how tough I am. I want to prove that I can survive, that I'm a survivor person or a prepper person or an alone kind of person. There are 3 instances of this duration of fasting. Moses on Mount Sinai where he received the law. Elijah when he was running from Jezebel after the Mount of Carmel outpouring of rain. And Jesus. This, and I'm sad to say, it only dawned on me yesterday, this actually gives new meaning to the Mount of Transfiguration meeting in which Moses and Elijah and Jesus meet on the Mount of Transfiguration. We'll go to the next slide, and I want to give you some more scripture. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. This is talking about Jesus. So when we talk about the temptation and the trial of Jesus, when we talk about the testing, we are in fact seeing that Jesus is living the walk and walking the talk. Now some years ago, our Bible Sunday school memory verses, and some of you will remember this, was Luke 12, 1 through 48. It was an ambitious memory and one that I read every Sunday morning to refresh me, to make sure I still have it memorized. And I noticed this in Luke 12, verse 29, and do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek His kingdom, and these things will be added to you. What we see is Jesus is living what He's preaching. And as He is about to be tested for those 40 days of fasting, there's also temptation that is going along. And I want to point out that He was tempted in every fashion as you and I are, yet without sin. And I'm going to get into that in every respect very shortly. I want you to see that temptation, we'll go to the next slide, the temptation tactics. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, for all that is in the world, and here are the 3 tactics of temptation. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but of the world. I want you to think of the first sin that happens, and it's the sin in the garden. And the temptation is for the forbidden fruit. And what happens? When the fruit was good for food, that's the lust of the flesh. When she saw it, that's the lust of the eyes. And that it was able to make one wise, that was the pride of life. You can see that from the very first temptation through every temptation, it is going to take one of those or all of those or some of those avenues as temptation points. All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life, is not of the Father but of the world. Next slide. This is by Russell Moore in his book, Tempted and Tried. I think this is a great quote. Temptation is so strong in our lives precisely because it is not about us. Temptation is an assault by the demonic powers on the rival kingdom of the Messiah. That's why conversion to Christ does not diminish the power of temptation, as we often would assume, but actually counterintuitively ratchets it up. If you bear the spirit of the one, the powers rage against. If you bear the spirit of the one, the powers rage against. They will seek to tear down the icon of the crucified that they see embedded in you. Which is by Russell Moore. I want you to know that the temptations may be personal, but they are about destroying the kingdom and testimony of Christ. That's what he's saying. Rachel Gilson in our next slide had this to say, and I thought this was fantastic. Saying no to something that our hearts long for can be a powerful display of the beauty and worth of what we are saying yes to in exchange. When we are tempted to sin and we say no, it is demonstrating a powerful, beautiful display of the worth of what we do say yes to. One more. We see three different titles used of Satan here. He is called the devil, the tempter, and Satan. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background in there. First of all, devil comes from the Greek word diabolos. Now, you might recognize that as like the word diabolic, but you might also recognize it as the Spanish word diablo. It has the idea of a false accuser or a slanderer. To slander, to defame, to accuse. The next is the tempter. And this idea is to endeavor, to scrutinize, to entice, to try, to examine. It comes from the word para, which means to test or try. And then the final word we have here is Satan. Satan is actually a borrowed word from the Old Testament word, Satan, which means an accuser. Satan was the term used for the same fallen angel, Lucifer. Now, in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10, we're told that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. That word is actually not this same word. That word is the word we get category from today. Kata agora, and it has the idea of the marketplace and being enticed. So, let's get into the message this morning. Our next slide. First of all, this temptation. And what I've done is I've tried to give just what the temptation was, what it was about, and how it aligned to the temptation tactic. Stones to bread. Now, for any of you that eat gluten-free, I want you to know that I can make bread that tastes like stone. I can make bread that's as crumbly as stone. But I can't make stones into bread. I can make stones that have, or bread that has the texture of stone, hard as a rock, but not stones to bread. And please again convey to your wife how thankful we are for the loaf of bread that she made us during Vacation Bible School. It was fantastic. It was not stone. Let's look here. The temptation of Jesus. And it tells us here in verse 3, and the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. So this is the temptation. And I want you to know that Satan has always used doubt as a temptation. He used doubt in the garden with Eve. Surely you will not die if you eat this. He casted doubt that God was not saying what he meant, or that God was not who he said he was. And we know how that turned out. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and every generation has had to say goodbye to the elders of that generation because of the perpetuation of death upon man. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And what is the temptation here? Well, you say, after 40 days, is it wrong to eat? Absolutely not. But where do you get your directives from? Think of it. When Noah was on the ark and they had run aground, you could conjecture from that it would be safe to leave the ark. And they did not. When Noah sent out the crow, or the raven, and the dove, and the raven did not return, you could conjecture from that. When he sent out again the dove the next week and it came back with an olive branch in its mouth, you could conjecture from that. When he removed the lid and could see the dry ground, you could conjecture from that it was time to leave. But he did not leave until God said, now you can leave. It was God that closed the door. It was God who allowed the door to swing open. We must not take our directives from ourselves or from the influence of the world or from the devil. We must let God be the one that controls our appetites. Not just our physical appetites of when we eat and what we eat, but the appetites of this body. What he was having to do was making a choice, the physical over the spiritual. I like what John the Apostle says in 2 John to Gaius, or maybe it's 3 John, where he says, I wish above all things that your health would be as strong, your physical health would be as strong as your physical health. That your spiritual health, or rather that your physical health would be as strong as your spiritual health. What is this then that he's offering? He's offering the lust of the flesh. But I want you to consider this, that in Luke chapter 4 and verse 2, when Jesus was in the wilderness, it says this, for 40 days, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days, and when they had ended, he became hungry. What am I saying? During the entire 40 days, Jesus endured the temptations of the devil. The fast was not a preparation for temptation that he would go through. Rather, the fasting resulted in Jesus being hungry. Satan jumped on this circumstance to tempt Jesus. Satan often takes advantages of our circumstances and wants to test us using those circumstances. He takes our needs and tempts us to meet them in wrong ways. Whether it's outside of marriage, whether it's outside of what is right, sin is sin, and the flesh should not direct the spirit. We should, in fact, be engulfed in the grace and arms of Jesus. How does Jesus respond to this temptation? He responds by citing Scripture. In this case, he cites Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 through 4. Jesus sets the right priority. Doing the will of God and being obedient to his every word is more important than food or any other material thing. Now, certainly, none of us are coming off a 40-day fast. As a matter of fact, for birthday Sunday, Belinda got a chocolate bar, and I'm wondering if she's on a 40-minute fast right now. We all tend to sniff around, come home from work, and know that supper is a half hour away or an hour away, and maybe go into the candy drawer, or maybe grab a few refrigerated M&Ms, or maybe do a snack. Maybe we are off